Robert's Rebellion, also known as the War of the Usurper, is one of the most significant turning points in the world of A Song of Ice and Fire. Though it takes place before the main events of the series, its impact reverberates through nearly every character and storyline. The rebellion brought an end to nearly 300 years of Targaryen rule, toppling a dynasty that had once been seen as untouchable. With the fall of House Targaryen, Westeros entered a new and uncertain era under House Baratheon. The rebellion reshaped the political landscape. Many of the great houses took sides, creating alliances and rivalries that persist into the main series. Families were torn apart, trust between noble houses was shattered, and a generation grew up in the shadow of the war's consequences. It also set the stage for key mysteries and themes in the series, particularly the question of Jon Snow's parentage and the true nature of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark's relationship. What began as a rebellion against the Mad King Aerys II also became a deeper story about honor, love, and the cost of vengeance. Many trace the origins of Robert's Rebellion to the day Lyanna Stark was allegedly abducted by Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, but the deeper roots of the conflict stretch back to the Grand Tourney at Harrenhal in 281 AC. Billed as the greatest tournament of its age, it drew together nearly every great house in Westeros under one roof. Yet behind the pageantry and celebration, tensions simmered. It was here that rumors swirled, loyalties shifted, and the cracks of House Targaryen's rule began to show. While swords would not be drawn for another year, the tourney at Harrenhal was the spark in the dry kindling, the moment that turned courtly whispers into a storm of rebellion. The tourney was announced in 280 AC by Lord Walter Went shortly after he was visited by his brother, Sir Oswell Went of the Kingsguard. The rewards offered by Walter were 3 times greater than those offered by Lord Tywin Lannister in the tourney in honor of Prince Viserys' birth at Lannisport in 276 AC. The lavish prizes offered by Lord Went brought hundreds of challengers to the tourney. Walter also wanted to present his massive castle and his 5 sons. While most believed House Went was displaying their wealth and splendor, some believed the Wents lacked the funding for the prizes and were instead supported by a shadow host. Maester Yandel suggests Rhaegar Targaryen, the Prince of Dragonstone. King Aerys II Targaryen attended the tournament only because Lord Varys warned him that Rhaegar, his son and the Crown Prince, arranged the tournament as a pretext to meet with several High Lords to discuss removing his father as king in an informal Great Council. Many in attendance were shocked by the king's physical decline. Lord Tywin Lannister was not at Harrenhal because of a quarrel with King Aerys, although many Westermen attended. During the tourney's opening ceremonies, 15-year-old Sir Jaime Lannister was admitted into the Order of the Kingsguard. King Aerys II Targaryen is said to have believed the cheering of the crowd was for himself instead of Jaime, and a young Pia was impressed with the handsome knight. Although Jaime wanted to compete in the tourney the next day, Aerys commanded him to return to King's Landing that night to guard Queen Rhaella and Prince Viserys. Held that first night within the Hall of 100 Hearths was a great feast for lords from throughout the 7 kingdoms. Besides Starks and Howland Reed, other Northmen in attendance were Dustons, Hornwoods, Manderleys, and Mormonts. Lord Robert Baratheon drank wine with Sir Richard Lonmouth, and a wandering crow sought recruits for the Night's Watch. Benjen Stark teased his sister Lyanna for crying at the singing of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, so Lyanna poured wine over her younger brother's head. This was the first instance that we know of when Rhaegar and Lyanna met. Beside Lyanna, at the tourney was also Lady Ashara Dane present. She danced with a knight of the Kingsguard, Prince Oberyn Martell, and Lord John Connington. Brandon Stark convinced Ashara to dance with his shy brother Eddard. There were rumors of a relationship between Ned and Ashara. According to Sir Barristan Selmy, Ashara was dishonored by a man at Harrenhal. Some say it was Ned, while others argue it was Benjen. Whoever it was, a year later she had a stillborn child, but soon after that she committed suicide, so we might never know what truly happened. The tourney took place over 10 days, of which the competition lasted 7, with 5 days allotted to the joust. There was a 7-sided melee in the ancient style, in which Lord Robert Baratheon unhorsed many. Besides the melee and the joust, the tourney included an archery contest, an axe-throwing contest, a horse race, and a tourney of singers. There was also a mummer show. Lord Walter Went's fair daughter was the Queen of Love and Beauty when the tourney began. Her honor was defended by her brothers and her uncle, Sir Oswell Went of the Kingsguard, but they were all defeated in the tourney. A mystery knight, the Knight of the Laughing Tree, appeared in the lists to fight for the honor of a Crannogman. King Aerys sent men, including Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, to learn the identity of the Mystery Knight, who appeared and disappeared mid-tourney, but they were unsuccessful. Prince Rhaegar was champion of the joust, defeating 4 knights of the Kingsguard, and in the end he chose Lyanna Stark as the new Queen of Love and Beauty, placing a crown of blue winter roses in her lap. This was scandalous in that not only was Rhaegar already married to Elia of Dorne, who was present at the tourney, but Lyanna herself was betrothed to Robert Baratheon. When winter returned at the coming of the new year, 282 AC, mere days before the planned wedding of Brandon Stark to Catelyn Tully at Riverrun, Prince Rhaegar Targaryen and 6 confidants abducted Brandon's sister, Lyanna Stark, less than 10 leagues from Harrenhal. Her brother, Brandon Stark, was on his way to Riverrun to wed Catelyn Tully when the news reached him. Brandon rode at once to King's Landing with his companions, Ethan Glover, Brandon's squire, Albert Arryn, nephew to Lord John Arryn and the heir of the Eyrie, Kyle Royce, and Geoffrey Mallister. Brandon rode for the Red Keep, and outside its gates, unaware that Rhaegar was not present, shouted for him to come out and die. King Aerys II had them all arrested for plotting the murder of the Crown Prince and summoned the fathers of all those who stood accused to court. Lord Rickard Stark, who had been on his way south with the wedding party for Brandon's wedding, went to King's Landing with 200 men. None of them returned north. In King's Landing, all of those who stood accused were executed, with the sole exception of Ethan Glover. King Aerys did allow for trials of a sort. Lord Rickard Stark demanded a trial by battle, and the king granted his request. Rickard dressed for battle, but Aerys declared fire to be the champion of House Targaryen. He had Rickard suspended from the rafters in the throne room, where his pyromancers, Rosart among them, kindled a blaze beneath the Lord of Winterfell. Brandon Stark was brought in as well and placed in a Tyroshi strangling device, while a longsword was placed just outside of his reach. Brandon was allowed to try and free his father, but the more he struggled to reach the sword, the tighter the cord around his neck became. Brandon strangled himself in an attempt to reach the sword and save his father, while Lord Rickard cooked in his armor. Next, Aerys demanded that Lord John Arryn send him the heads of Lord Robert Baratheon of Storm's End, Lyanna's betrothed, and Eddard Stark, now the Lord of Winterfell after the deaths of his father and older brother. Robert and Eddard were Jon's wards at the Eyrie, however, and Jon instead raised his banners in revolt. This act is seen as the start of the war, which would last close to a year. Fighting began in the Vale of Arryn. Though Jon Arryn called for all his banners, not all of his bannermen sided with him. Ned Stark left the Eyrie to gather his bannermen from the north, while Lord Arryn began to call his own vassals from the Vale of Arryn in rebellion to the Iron Throne. The city of Gulltown remained loyal to the Targaryen dynasty, however, and rather than sailing from there, Ned returned to the north via the Mountains of the Moon, the Fingers, and Sisterton. Jon Arryn also faced opposition from loyalists attempting to bring him down. While Ned was making his way north, Lord Arryn led the rebel bannermen from the Vale against Gulltown, which was defended by House Grafton. Robert, a close friend of Ned, was the first of the rebels to gain the walls of Gulltown. Robert slew Lord Mark Grafton with his own hand. The taking of Gulltown by Jon Arryn allowed the defender of the Vale to consolidate rebel control in the Vale of Arryn. Lyn Corbray won his knighthood fighting alongside House Grafton at the gates of Gulltown, but he joined Lord Arryn after the battle. After the taking of Gulltown, Lord Robert Baratheon returned to Storm's End and called his bannermen in rebellion against King Aerys II Targaryen. However, some of the Storm Lords remained loyal to Aerys and, encouraged by Lord Owen Merryweather, the Hand of the King, they rejected Robert's commands. Lords Catherine, Fell, and Grandison were going to join forces at Summerhall, a ruined castle of House Targaryen in the Dornish Marches, and then march on Storm's End to confront their liege lord. Robert, catching wind of it, raced with his forces to meet them. Not much is known about the battle, only that Robert managed to arrive first and won 3 battles in a single day, defeating the forces of the 3 loyalist houses in turn as they arrived. Additionally, Robert killed Lord Fell in single combat. Robert consolidated his power in the Stormlands, winning the support of the rest of the Storm Lords, which allowed him to march towards the Reach with no enemy forces loose in his rear. Following his victory at Summerhall, Robert was now free to march north to join up with Jon Arryn and the Northmen. With the Stormlands united behind him following the battles at Summerhall, Lord Robert Baratheon left his brother Stannis to hold Storm's End and advanced west to Ashford. Ashford, located within the Reach, was sworn to Highgarden and was likely a loyalist holding. It is possible that Robert tried to take Ashford to secure the Stormlands' western flank against the threat of the Tyrells, who could muster the largest army in the realm, or he may have been outmaneuvered by Lord Randyll Tarly. The battle occurred when the van of the Tyrell army, under command of Lord Randyll Tarly, ran into Lord Robert Baratheon's forces. Randyll's forces overran Robert's army, and Robert was forced to withdraw from the field before the main force of the Tyrell host had joined the battle. Lord Catherine, a former Targaryen loyalist who had joined the rebels after his defeat at Summerhall, was cut down by Randyll whilst fighting for Robert. Randyll had his head sent to King Aerys II Targaryen. On the Reach side, one casualty of note was Lord Mace's cousin, Sir Quentyn Tyrell. Faced with the large numbers of the main Tyrell force, Robert had no choice but to withdraw from the south and attempt to link up with his allies in the north. To this end, he force-marched his troops north towards the Riverlands. Robert's withdrawal from the Stormlands allowed the victorious Tyrell army to invade the Stormlands and lay siege to Storm's End. However, the result of the battle was marked by Tyrion Lannister as indecisive. King Aerys, due to the events in the Stormlands, came to believe that his Hand of the King, Lord Owen Merryweather, was ineffectual. The king was even considering that Merryweather might have been so ineffectual as to possibly aid the rebellion. As a result, Owen was stripped of his lands and titles and exiled. Lord John Connington, a friend of Rhaegar's with a reputation of a warrior, was named as hand in Owen's stead. Eddard Stark had managed to reach Winterfell where he called his banners. He marched south with his forces and joined up with Lord Jon Arryn. Together, they negotiated with Lord Hoster Tully, the Lord of Riverrun, for his support. Lord John Connington led a mighty army into the field. The forces he commanded gave chase, and Robert's march became a grueling one. Robert, wounded through unknown means, and all alone, eventually took refuge at Stony Sept. John Connington's forces took the town by force and began to search every house. The residents of the town were actively helping Robert, however, and despite the search, they offered pardons and rewards. The threats and the hostages Connington took and hung in crow cages. They could not find Robert. The battle began when Lords Stark and Tully arrived with a rebel army. The soldiers fought in the streets and alleys and on the rooftops, and the Septons rang the bells to warn the residents to lock their doors. Battle was fierce, and John Connington managed to wound Hoster Tully and kill Jon Arryn's cousin, Sir Dennis Arryn. Eventually, Robert Baratheon came out of the Peach, the brothel in which he had been hiding, and fought with Connington, almost killing him. Suspicious of the loss at the Stony Sept, King Aerys exiled John Connington, stripping him of his titles. Aerys began to realize that Robert was the greatest threat to his dynasty since Daemon I Blackfyre, and he named Lord Carleton Chelstead as his Hand of the King in Connington's stead. Sir Jonathor Derry and Sir Barristan Selmy of the Kingsguard were sent to rally Connington's men, while their Lord Commander Sir Gerald Hightower was sent by King Aerys to find Rhaegar Targaryen. The Crown Prince finally returned from the south, but left Gerald, Sir Arthur Dayne, and Sir Oswald Went to guard Lyanna at the Tower. After returning, Rhaegar convinced Aerys to ask Tywin Lannister for help, just as the rebels had or would do at one point. Additionally, Aerys commanded his alchemists to place caches of wildfire on multiple locations in King's Landing. With both Elbert and Dennis Arryn now dead, Jon Arryn was in need of an heir. Hoster Tully swiftly betrothed his daughter Lysa, who had previously proven fertile, to Jon. In a double ceremony at Riverrun, Eddard Stark and Jon Arryn married Hoster's daughters, Catelyn and Lysa respectively. Amongst those present at the wedding was Robert. Around this time, he announced his claim for the Iron Throne and led the combined Arryn, Baratheon, Stark, and Tully host of rebels. After returning, Prince Rhaegar took command of the royalist army. However, before leaving King's Landing, young Jaime wanted to join his prince in the battle as well. Rhaegar had put his hand on Jaime's shoulder. "When this battle's done, I mean to call a council. Changes will be made. I meant to do it long ago, but, well, it does no good to speak of roads not taken. We shall talk when I return." Which confirms that Rhaegar was intending to overthrow his father. and that confirms that the tourney was indeed set up so Rhaegar could meet with all the lords and noble highborns at one time to discuss the future of the reign. Oswell Went was a member of the Kingsguard, and his brother was Lord of Harrenhal. Oswell knew how mad the king was, and was one of the people urging Rhaegar to step in and rule. Oswell arranged with his brother to host the tourney at Harrenhal. It was the perfect opportunity. However, King Aerys, who rarely left King's Landing, attended. Since Duskendale, the king would have never went, but Varys told him that Rhaegar was planning something, so the king was there. Not only that, but Aerys announced Jaime to the Kingsguard at the tourney, effectively stopping the Lannisters from entering into the marriage pact with the Tullys. However, everything goes wrong after that. The Mystery Knight appears, Rhaegar gives the crown of love and beauty to Lyanna, the disappearances, and all the rest. The original plan was not for Rhaegar to depose King Aerys, but for Rhaegar to rule as regent until Aerys died. Aerys would be detained and watched somewhere until his death. That was the original plan. However, Rhaegar had most likely realized that the recent events with Lyanna had changed his path. It is very possible that Rhaegar was going to call a council meeting, accept temporary regency until he could secure Viserys on the throne. If Rhaegar intended to stay with Lyanna, I do not think he would have had the support he once enjoyed before the tourney at Harrenhal. How many houses would support Rhaegar as king if he either abandoned his wife and 2 children for a teenager from the north, or kidnapped one? Rhaegar must have had an alternative plan in his mind. Either way, it was clear that he was finally ready to remove his father as king. The day had been windy when he said farewell to Rhaegar in the yard of the Red Keep. The prince had donned his night-black armor with a 3-headed dragon picked out in rubies on his breastplate. "Your Grace," Jaime had pleaded, "let Darry stay to guard the king this once, or Sir Barristan. Their cloaks are as white as mine." Prince Rhaegar shook his head. "My royal sire fears your father more than he does our cousin Robert. He wants you close, so Lord Tywin cannot harm him. I dare not take that crutch away from him at such an hour." Jaime's anger had risen in his throat. "I'm not a crutch. I'm a knight of the Kingsguard." "Then guard the king," Sir Jon Darry snapped at him. "When you donned that cloak, you promised to obey." Rhaegar had put his hand on Jaime's shoulder. "When this battle's done, I mean to call a council. Changes will be made. I meant to do it long ago, but, well, it does no good to speak of roads not taken. We shall talk when I return." Jaime clearly did not want to guard the king. He was a teenager, and Aerys was mad. Jaime was essentially a hostage and longed for battle. Rhaegar promised change, implying that once he returned he would call a council, and Jaime would no longer be obligated to remain in the Red Keep. I believe Rhaegar would have returned and, as soon as he was regent, released Jaime. Jaime was truly the son Tywin needed to carry on House Lannister's legacy. It would also have garnered goodwill with the Riverlands, as Jaime could then marry Lysa Tully. However, to fulfill his plan, Rhaegar needed to defeat his cousin and march toward the Trident to face him. Although Prince Doran Martell initially refused to send aid to Aerys, both out of caution and anger over Elya's treatment, he was quickly reminded by Aerys that Princess Elia was in his power. Aerys dispatched her uncle, Prince Lewin Martell of the Kingsguard, to assume command of 10,000 Dornishmen marching up the King's Road who joined Rhaegar's royalist army en route to the Trident. At the same time, Sir Barristan Selmy and Sir Jonathor Darry, also of the Kingsguard, were sent to rally the scattered forces of Lord John Cunnington. Led by the loyalist Lords Mace Tyrell and Paxter Redwyn, the Redwyn fleet and most of the levies from the Reach were at the siege of Storm's End. The battle took place at the chief crossing of the Trident, near the crossroads of the River Road and the King's Road, where Rhaegar Targaryen attempted to cross the river. Robert Baratheon used his booming voice to command during the fighting. Dornishmen under Prince Lewin Martell threatened Robert's left flank. When Lord Corbray fell wounded, Sir Lyn Corbray took up his father's Valyrian steel sword, Lady Forlorn, and led a charge that broke the Dornishmen. During the charge, Lyn killed the already injured Lewin. Elsewhere in the battle, Sir Barristan killed a dozen of Robert and Eddard Stark's companions, and Lord Jason Mallister slew 3 of Rhaegar's bannermen. Though many great lords and knights either lost their lives or earned renown in the fighting, the battle was decided when Robert and Rhaegar met in single combat on horseback in the river. Robert ultimately crushed Rhaegar's chest with a blow from his warhammer, forged by Donal Noy. The impact shattered the rubies on Rhaegar's breastplate, scattering them in the water and giving the ruby fort its name. Leaderless, the royalist army broke and fled to King's Landing. Wounded by arrow, spear, and sword, Barristan Selmy was near death when brought before Robert. Though Lord Roose Bolton advised killing him, Robert spared Barristan's life and sent his maester to treat him. Lord Wyman Manderley later rewarded Sir Bartimus with the Wolf's Den for saving his life during the battle. The sons of Mors Umber were killed at the Trident, and Lord Grandison died a year later from wounds sustained there. Lord Goodbrook's son made peace with Lord Hoster Tully and Robert after the battle. Lord Walder Frey arrived too late to fight, earning the nickname the late Lord Frey from Hoster, who questioned his loyalty. Because Robert was wounded in the battle, he tasked Eddard Stark with pursuing the remnants of the Targaryen army to King's Landing, where the Red Keep was still held by thousands of loyalists. Around the same time, Quellan Greyjoy, Lord of the Iron Islands, hoped to remain neutral during the war. But after the news of Rhaegar's death reached Pike, his eldest sons, Balon, Euron, and Victarion, persuaded him to join the rebels to claim spoils. Quellan led 50 longships to raid the Reach, strong supporters of House Targaryen. As House Lannister's intentions were still unclear, most of the Ironborn fleet remained at home to defend against possible western aggression. The Greyjoys raided coastal villages and towns, but were met at the mouth of the Mander by the longships of the Shield Islands. 12 Ironborn ships were lost, but the Greyjoys emerged victorious. Lord Quellan, however, was slain in the fighting. His son, Balon Greyjoy, returned to Pike to claim the Seastone chair, and the Iron Islands' contribution to the rebellion remained minor. When news of Rhaegar's death reached King's Landing, Aerys sent his pregnant wife, Queen Rhaella, and their young son, Prince Viserys, to Dragonstone for safety. However, believing Lewin Martell and the Dornishmen had betrayed Rhaegar, Aerys refused to send Rhaegar's wife, Princess Elia Martell, or their children, Princess Rhaenys and Prince Aegon, instead keeping them in the Red Keep as hostages to secure Dorne's loyalty. Aerys had been preparing his wildfire plot well before the Battle of the Trident. After Robert's victory at the Battle of the Bells, Aerys feared the rebellion might succeed. He enlisted the Alchemist's Guild to prepare to destroy King's Landing if the rebels prevailed. Sir Jaime Lannister was present during this planning. The rest of the Kingsguard were either absent or with Rhaegar. Thousands of jars of wildfire were hidden throughout the city, in the Dragon Pit, the Great Sept of Baelor, beneath the gates, and even in the Red Keep. The pyromancers worked in secret, excluding even their apprentices from the knowledge. Most of House Targaryen was unaware of this scheme. Queen Rhaella had long ignored her husband's madness, and Rhaegar was focused on raising his army. Lord Carlton Chelstead, the Hand of the King, became suspicious of the pyromancers' movements. When he uncovered the plot and confronted Aerys, his arguments failed. He resigned, throwing his chair of office at the king's feet. Aerys had him burned alive and named Rossart, a pyromancer, as his new hand. About a fortnight after the Trident, Tywin Lannister appeared at King's Landing with 12,000 men, claiming loyalty to Aerys and requesting entry. Varys advised keeping the gates shut, but Grand Maester Pycelle convinced the king to let them in. The Lannister army began sacking the city. Sir Jaime Lannister, defending the Red Keep, asked permission to negotiate terms. Aerys refused and ordered him to kill Lord Tywin. Realizing Aerys would destroy the city, Jaime killed Rossart before he could carry out the plan. Jaime then confronted and killed Aerys in the throne room just as Lannister soldiers burst in. Witnessing the act, they dubbed Jaime Kingslayer. Jaime ordered the men to spread the news of Aerys' death. When asked whether to proclaim a new king, Jaime considered Viserys and Aegon, but dismissed both. He told them to proclaim whoever they wished and sat on the Iron Throne, waiting. Meanwhile, fighting continued at the Red Keep. Lord Eddard Stark arrived, leading his Northmen through the King's Gate. He entered the throne room and silently stared at Jaime, who rose and said he had been keeping the throne warm for Robert. To prove their loyalty, the Lannisters knew Rhaegar's children had to die. Sir Gregor Clegane and Sir Amory Lorch scaled Maegor's holdfast. Amory dragged Princess Rhaenys from under her bed and stabbed her repeatedly. Gregor smashed infant Aegon's skull against a wall, then murdered Princess Elia Martell with the child's blood still on his hands. When Robert Baratheon arrived in King's Landing, Tywin laid the bodies of Elia, Aegon, and Rhaenys beneath the Iron Throne and presented them to Robert as tokens of his fealty. The children were wrapped in crimson cloaks to hide the blood. While Rhaenys was recognizable, Aegon was a faceless horror of bone and brain and gore, and no one looked long at him, believing Tywin at his word when he stated it was Aegon. Although the actions of Gregor and Amory have been discussed in rumors and are even considered common knowledge in Casterly Rock, the murderers of Elia and her children have never been publicly confirmed. Some explanations gathered by Maester Yandel for his work, The World of Ice and Fire, include that the Mad King commanded their deaths after learning of Tywin's betrayal, or that Elia killed her own children to prevent them from falling into rebel hands. Oberyn Martell is convinced Tywin himself ordered the deaths of his sister, Elia, and her children in revenge for her marriage to Rhaegar, whom Tywin had wanted to marry to his own daughter, Cersei. Lords Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon argued over the killing of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen's family. While Eddard believed it to have been unjustified murder, Robert had been satisfied with the deaths of Rhaegar's children, whom he described as dragon spawn. Even Jon Arryn, Lord of the Eyrie, was not able to calm their anger, and Eddard rode south the next day to fight the final battles of the war in the south. Lord Tywin Lannister gave royalist survivors of the sack, such as Sir Jeremy Riker and Sir Alliser Thorne, the choice of joining the Night's Watch or being executed. Both knights chose the Wall. In the days that followed the sack of King's Landing, Jaime Lannister sought out and killed Garrigus and Bellis, the remaining two pyromancers aware of the wildfire plot. While Robert's rebellion is considered to have ended at the sack of King's Landing, not all battles were fought. In the south, the siege of Storm's End continued, while Lyanna Stark was still missing. The siege of Storm's End had begun after the Battle of Ashford, driving Robert away from his base of power. The Tyrell host defeated resistance in the Stormlands and marched on Storm's End. The castle's granaries and storehouses were only half full, as war had been unexpected. Soon after Lord Mace Tyrell began besieging Storm's End with the Reach's host, Lord Paxter Redwyn arrived with the Redwyn fleet from the Arbor and closed Shipbreaker Bay to all trade, essentially cutting Storm's End off. The siege continued for the better part of a year, with the garrison having to eat their horses, dogs, and cats, and were nearly forced to eat their own dead. Donal Noy lost an arm during the siege after an axe wound festered. Meanwhile, Mace and his bannermen, such as Paxter and Lord Mathis Rowan, feasted within sight of the walls. Some of Mace's strength joined the army of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. Davos, a notorious smuggler, eventually slipped through the Redwyn fleet's lines one night and entered a tunnel beneath Storm's End with a ship loaded with onions and saltfish for the starving garrison. This food allowed the garrison to survive long enough for Robert's friend and ally, Lord Eddard Stark, to march south after the Battle of the Trident. With King Aerys II Targaryen dead and the surviving Targaryens fled to Dragonstone, Mace dipped his banners as soon as Eddard and the rebels appeared on the field outside Storm's End. After lifting the siege at Storm's End, Lord Eddard Stark rode further south to the Red Mountains of Dorne. According to his fever dream, Eddard traveled to the Tower of Joy with 6 northern companions: Howland Reed, Lord William Dustin, Ethan Glover, Martin Cassell, Theo Wool, and Sir Mark Riswell. They approached the tower to recover Eddard's sister Lyanna, but found the tower protected by Gerald, Arthur, and Oswell of the Kingsguard. Eddard recalls that he and Howland were the only survivors of the ensuing conflict. The exact circumstances of Arthur and his companions' deaths are unclear. Recorded history describes Arthur as being killed by Lord Eddard in single combat. However, Bran Stark recalls his father, Eddard, describing Arthur as the finest knight he ever saw, and elaborating further that Arthur would have killed him if not for Howland Reed. After defeating their opponents, Eddard entered into the Tower of Joy, where he found a dying Lyanna in a room smelling of blood and roses. She claimed a promise from her brother before she died, and Howland removed Ned's hand from hers. Afterwards, Eddard traveled to Starfall to return Arthur's greatsword, Dawn, to House Dane. As a sign of respect towards Arthur, however, sometime after his visit, Ashara jumped from the top of the Pale Stone Sword, one of the towers of Starfall, into the sea. Several characters have cited possible reasons for Ashara's decision to commit suicide. A broken heart because of her stillborn daughter, because of a stolen child, for the man who had dishonored her at Harrenhal, or due to grief over Arthur's death. Her body was never found. When Eddard returned home to Winterfell, he brought with him his bastard son, Jon Snow. This strained the relationship with his wife, Catelyn, who had given birth to their son Robb at Riverrun during the war. Eddard refused to speak to her about Jon's mother. However, stories concerning her identity circulated nonetheless. When Catelyn heard rumors that the boy's mother was the Dornish noblewoman Ashara Dane, she confronted Eddard about it, but he told her in a brusque manner that the child was his blood, and that was all she needed to know. He subsequently silenced the rumors about Ashara. Sansa Stark recalls hearing whispers that Jon's mother was common-born. Lord Edric Dane believes that, rather than his aunt Ashara, Jon Snow's mother was a woman called Wylla, who worked for House Dane and at one point served as Edric's wet nurse. When asked about the mother of his bastard son by King Robert I Baratheon, Eddard also mentions the name Wylla. However, Lord Godric Borrell claims that the daughter of the fisherman who sneaked Eddard away from the Fingers gave birth to Jon Snow. Eddard buried the bones of his deceased kin in the crypt of Winterfell. Breaking the tradition of only Stark kings and lords having statues, Ned had them carved for Brandon and Lyanna next to that of Lord Rickard. In between the Battle of the Trident and the sack of King's Landing, Queen Rhaella Targaryen and her son and Aerys' new heir, Prince Viserys Targaryen, had been sent to the island of Dragonstone with the Red Keep's Master-at-Arms Sir William Darry. There, Viserys was crowned by his mother. While on the mainland, Stannis Baratheon began constructing a new royal fleet to lead an assault on Dragonstone. In 284 AC, 9 months after the flight to Dragonstone, Rhaella died giving birth to Princess Daenerys Targaryen during a great storm that destroyed the Targaryen fleet at anchor at the island. With most of the Targaryen fleet destroyed, and with the Baratheon fleet ready to take Dragonstone, the household of the last Targaryen stronghold was willing to sell the children to the new king, Robert I Baratheon. Shortly before Stannis sailed to Dragonstone, however, William Darry and 4 loyal men smuggled Viserys, Daenerys, and her wet nurse from the nursery and sailed to the Braavosian coast, and the children subsequently lived in exile in the free cities. While Stannis was successful in leading the assault on Dragonstone, Robert scorned him for allowing Willem and the children to escape. Following the conclusion of the rebellion, Robert I Baratheon was successfully installed as the new Lord of the Seven Kingdoms. He chose his second father, Lord Jon Arryn, as his Hand of the King. Pardoning many of his former enemies, Robert appointed Sir Barristan Selmy as the Lord Commander of his Kingsguard. Despite Eddard Stark urging Robert to strip Sir Jaime Lannister of his white cloak, Robert listened to Jon's advice and pardoned Jaime together with the Master of Whisperers, Lord Varys, and the Grand Maester, Pycelle, and Jaime continued to serve in the Kingsguard along with Barristan. At his coronation feast, Robert joked to Jaime about the fact that Jaime was already being called Kingslayer. Robert allowed Sir Ronald Connington to keep Griffin's Roost, although Robert kept the gold, and most of House Connington's lands were granted to neighbors. Robert replaced the skulls of the Targaryen dragons in the Red Keep's throne room with banners and tapestries depicting hunting and battle. Robert tasked his brother Stannis with building a new royal fleet and capturing Dragonstone, the last Targaryen loyalist stronghold, where the pregnant Dowager Queen Rhaella Targaryen and her son Viserys remained. Stannis led the assault on Dragonstone some 9 months after the Trident, but Viserys and the newly born Daenerys Targaryen had been smuggled from the island shortly before by Sir Willem Darry. Robert blamed Stannis for letting the Targaryen children escape, even though the 2 children had been spirited to safety by Targaryen loyalists shortly before Stannis had set sail. As he now resided in King's Landing, Robert granted the ancestral Baratheon seat of Storm's End to his youngest brother Renly, while naming Stannis as Lord of Dragonstone. Both Stannis and Queen Cersei Lannister believe that Robert intended this as a slight against Stannis, but according to George R.R. Martin, Robert had not necessarily meant it as such. Dragonstone had traditionally been the seat of the heir to the Iron Throne, the Prince of Dragonstone, during most of the Targaryen dynasty, so the then childless Robert was granting it to his heir at the time, Stannis. Stannis became the head of House Baratheon of Dragonstone, with Robert heading House Baratheon of King's Landing. Although peace returned to the Seven Kingdoms, many of those who did not support Robert referred to him as the usurper. Dorne never forgot or forgave that Robert condoned the murders of Princess Elia Martell and her 2 young children, Princess Rhaenys and Prince Aegon. The year after Robert took the throne, Elia's younger brother, Prince Oberyn, began plotting a rebellion in the name of the exiled Viserys. Lord Jon Arryn, Robert's new Hand of the King, traveled to Dorne, sat down with Doran Martell, the Prince of Dorne, and ended all talk of rebellion. Regardless, Robert never visited Dorne. So Robert's rebellion was more than just a war for love or a fight against tyranny. It was the turning point that shattered the Targaryen dynasty and reshaped the political landscape of Westeros. Though it ended with Robert Baratheon on the Iron Throne, the consequences of the rebellion echoed far beyond its final battle. The fall of House Targaryen scattered its last heirs, setting Daenerys and Viserys on the path to exile and vengeance. The lies told and secrets kept during the rebellion, most notably the truth behind Jon Snow's parentage, continue to unravel generations later, driving the central conflict of the series. In many ways, the rebellion was the first domino to fall in the larger saga of A Song of Ice and Fire, where honor clashes with ambition, and the past is never truly buried. It marked the end of one era and laid the foundation for the chaos, war, and prophecy that would define the epic to come.